The flame flickers gently, casting shadows that dance along the worn vellum of an ancient map. Its surface, cracked and brown by time, bears names that no longer echo in the streets or fields of modern Europe. Kingdoms once drawn in confident ink now blur into the folds and creases, their borders fading like memories softened by age. Burgundy, Arles, Moravia, Elmet, names that have slipped from daily speech, yet once commanded loyalty, prayers, and fear. In the hush of a stone chamber, tucked away from the noise of the waking world, a traveler might trace a slow finger along these ghostly lines, feeling the contours of forgotten realms. Here stood cities once illuminated by torchlight and song. Here rode kings whose banners were embroidered with lions, stars, and crosses, stitched by quiet hands in tall windowed keeps. These kingdoms were not always large or long-lived, but each had a rhythm, a heartbeat composed of rituals, language, and belief. We are told that history is written by victors. But what of those who left no victors behind? No conquest to enshrine them, no heirs to whisper their names. The vanished kingdoms of medieval Europe lived not just in stone and scroll, but in the shape of laws, in the songs sung before harvest, in the patterns of fields now broken by time. They were as real as the chill of iron or the scent of incense. And though they lie buried beneath centuries of soil and silence, they are not truly gone. To explore these forgotten lands is not to hunt for drama or spectacle, but to listen for quieter truths. The sigh of a cathedral built for a prince now nameless, the fading outlines of a marketplace where no coin has changed hands for 1,000 years. It is to feel the weight of time not as something lost, but as something layered. Beneath the world we know lies another, waiting. The Middle Ages were never still. Borders shifted like tides. Kingdoms rose in the span of a lifetime, only to vanish like smoke at the edge of war or marriage. Some were absorbed into greater empires. Others simply drifted into the folds of history, their stories too soft or scattered to survive the scribes. Yet all of them mattered. They fed the soil from which today's nations grew, shaped the languages we speak, and held the dreams of countless lives. So let us begin here, by candlelight, where silence allows the past to speak. Each flame, each breath of warmth in the dark, calls forth a different kingdom. One you may never have heard of, but that once stood tall beneath sun and sky. We will walk gently through these stories, not to judge or rekindle battles, but to listen. And as we listen, the map unfurls, layer by layer, shadow by shadow, until the forgotten becomes familiar and the past rests peacefully beside us. Close your eyes now. The journey begins. The lost crown of Great Moravia, east of the winding Danube, where mists hang low over valleys and forests once teemed with wolves, there stood a kingdom whose name is now little more than a whisper in the chronicles of time. Great Moravia, a realm born in the shadow of collapsing empires and gone before the first millennium had ended. In the 9th century, the people of this land, Slavic tribes bound by river and forest, found themselves at a crossroads. To the west, the mighty Frankish Empire loomed with its iron and Latin rites. To the east, the Byzantine influence beckoned with silk-robed priests and the allure of ancient knowledge. And between these great powers, Moravia dared to dream of its own crown. It began with a ruler named Majmir I, whose name clings faintly to history like moss to stone. He united scattered tribes into a single principality, and under his reign, the foundations of Moravian statehood were laid. But it was under his successor, Rastislav, that Moravia stepped fully into the light. Rastislav, sensing the growing need for cultural identity and spiritual cohesion, invited two brothers from distant Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius. Their task, to bring the Christian faith not in Latin, but in the language of the people. And so, they gave the Slavs their first alphabet, the glagolitic script, a gift more lasting than any sword or scepter. For a time, Moravia bloomed. Churches rose from timber and stone. Monasteries echoed with new prayers. Diplomats rode between courts with parchment scrolls sealed in wax, speaking for a kingdom that had found its voice. But greatness in the Middle Ages was often measured in seasons. The pressures came swiftly from invading Magyars, from internal strife, and from the cold suspicion of neighboring empires. As alliances frayed and leaders faltered, the kingdom crumbled, its light dimming just as it had begun to burn bright. By the early 10th century, Great Moravia had vanished from the political map. Its lands were carved and claimed, its churches repurposed or razed, and its people folded into the future of other states. And yet, its spirit did not vanish. The alphabet birthed their spread through Eastern Europe, evolving into Cyrillic. The Christian traditions it nurtured took root far beyond its borders. The legacy of Great Moravia lived on, not in crowns, but in culture. What is a kingdom, truly? Is it the throne room or the thought? The stone wall or the whispered prayer? Moravia reminds us that even the briefest of nations can echo long after the last banner has fallen. And so we leave its memory behind, like pilgrims stepping through a fog-laced valley. The Danube continues its flow, the forests remain thick with shadow, and somewhere beneath the soil, the dreams of Moravia sleep still, unclaimed but not forgotten. Let us follow the river west now, where another kingdom once shimmered between mountains and vineyards, a realm of poets and intrigue, a land called Burgundy. The Shadow Kingdom of Burgundy. Between the soaring Alps and the slow-rolling rivers of eastern Gaul, beneath skies veiled in morning mist, there once lay a kingdom of uncommon grace and quiet ambition. Burgundy, a name that would echo across centuries, worn by kings, poets, and dukes, but never quite held in place. In the early days, Burgundy was born from the ashes of Rome, carved out by migrating peoples seeking new soil to till and new gods to worship. Its earliest rulers, Burgundian in name and Gothic in spirit, set down their roots in what is now southeastern France and western Switzerland. But like so many kingdoms of the time, Burgundy did not remain whole for long. It fractured, reformed, and fractured again, its boundaries redrawn more by marriage and papal decree than by conquest. And yet, through these centuries of shifting borders, Burgundy endured, not always as a singular state, but as a presence, soft as velvet, firm as oak. The kings of Upper and Lower Burgundy eventually merged into the Kingdom of Arles, a realm nominally ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor, but governed in practice by its own rhythms and rules. Later, the title of Burgundy would pass to powerful dukes whose courts rivaled those of kings in splendor. In its height, Burgundy was a tapestry of mountain strongholds, vine-covered hills, and bustling market towns. Its people worshipped in towering Romanesque cathedrals and walked roads first paved by legionaries. Its monks illuminated texts with golden ink, while its knights, clad in steel and silk, rode beneath banners that caught the sun like fire. Yet for all its beauty, Burgundy was a kingdom defined by shadow. It never held the unified might of France, nor the rigid strength of the empire. Instead, it moved through history like a phantom noble, respected, admired, but never fully seen. Its identity blurred between duchy and kingdom, between independence and vassalage. By the 15th century, the Duchy of Burgundy reached dazzling heights under Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. These were rulers who dreamed not just of regional power, but of a Burgundian state that could rival France itself. But dreams made too large are often the first to fall. At the death of Charles in 1477, without a legitimate male heir, the lands were contested and divided. Burgundy, once again, slipped from prominence, not with a final battle, but with a quiet unraveling. What remains today of Burgundy is found in stone and song, in the soft echo of choir voices in the Abbey of Cluny, in the gentle slope of vineyard hills near Beaune, in the forgotten clauses of treaties and the faint gold of ancient manuscripts. Burgundy teaches us that not all kingdoms disappear with thunder. Some simply fade, like the last light on a stained glass window at dusk, briefly brilliant, then gone. Let us follow that fading light now, further north and further back, into a kingdom half remembered and half imagined. A place of ancient names and whispered myths, the lost realm of Ebrach. Ebrach, the forgotten kings of the north. Before England was England, before the crowns of Wessex and Mercia stitched their legacy into the tapestry of one nation, there were older kingdoms, fragile, fleeting, and mysterious. One of these was Ebrach, a realm shrouded in fog and legend, clinging to the bones of Roman stone and the breath of Celtic song. Set in what we now call Yorkshire, Ebrach took its name from the old Roman city of Eboracum, a fortress of empire turned ghost town as Roman legions withdrew from Britannia in the early 5th century. In the silence that followed, when the roads crumbled and the mosaics faded, new powers stirred from the ashes of civilization. Tribal chieftains and warlords stepped into the abandoned forums, claiming not just land, but memory. Ebrach rose in this half-lit dawn. It was a Brittonic kingdom, Celtic in speech, Christian in soul, Roman in ruin. Its kings likely ruled from hill forts and remnants of stone halls, surrounded by mist-wreathed forests and marshes that swallowed unwary travelers. The people here worshipped in humble chapels built near the ruins of Roman basilicas, where ivy crept through broken columns and sparrows nested in shattered arches. Very little survives of Ebrach in the written record. There are fragments, names in genealogies, traces in old Welsh poems, echoes in place names like York and Elmet. Some believe Ebrach was part of the larger kingdom of the Hen Ogledd, the Old North, a patchwork of Brittonic states resisting the tide of Anglo-Saxon expansion. Others see it as a mere myth, a literary flourish on the edges of fact. But even myths carry truth, especially in the medieval world, where story and history were rarely kept apart. The kings of Ebrach, if they existed as more than names, would have faced a world of constant threat. Raiders from the sea, Saxon settlers from the south, and rival Brittonic lords from the west. Their rule may have lasted mere generations, but in those brief years, they stood as guardians of a vanishing world, one where Latin prayers mixed with native hymns and Roman roads led into the deep, green unknown. To reflect on Ebrach is to feel the silence between the stones of York Minster. It is to walk the city walls at twilight and wonder who else once looked down upon the river Ouse, dreaming of kingship while knowing the earth beneath them was already shifting. Ebrach reminds us that not all rulers are crowned in ceremony or remembered in scrolls. Some are known only by the ghosts they leave behind. And so, the forgotten kings of the north fade once more into the fog, their names scattered like autumn leaves across the old Roman roads. But their story lingers, soft and uncertain, an invitation to imagine what once was. Now, let us leave the misty dales behind and travel southward to a land caught between crescent and cross, a kingdom on the edge of two worlds where Gothic walls faced desert winds. Let's enter the contested frontier of Septimania. Septimania, the Gothic frontier. Far to the south, where the Pyrenees cast long shadows across sun-baked fields and the sea laps gently at stone-walled ports, there once existed a kingdom balanced delicately between faiths, empires, and languages. Septimania, a name that has nearly disappeared, carried now only in dusty scrolls and the quiet murmur of ruined cloisters. Yet once, this slender ribbon of land at the edge of Gaul stood as a frontier of dreams and danger. Septimania began its tale in the wake of empire. After Rome loosened its grip on Western Europe, the Visigoths moved in, first as guests, then as rulers. They claimed the fertile crescent of land between the Pyrenees and the Rhone, creating a sanctuary for Gothic nobility and Roman customs. Towns like Narbonne and Béziers thrived with hybrid vigor. Gothic laws written in Latin, Roman villas rebuilt by Gothic hands, Christian bishops preaching to congregations who still remembered the thunder of Roman legions. But this frontier was never still. In the early 8th century, the rising tide of Islam swept across the Iberian Peninsula and pressed northward into what was once Gothic land. Muslim emirs took Septimania's cities with relative ease. Narbonne fell in 719, and for a time, minarets rose beside crumbling aqueducts, and Arabic chants echoed in places where Latin hymns once held sway. Yet this too would not last. Charles Martel, Frankish prince and defender of what would become Christendom, marched south with iron resolve. Over years of battle and siege, the Franks reclaimed Septimania city by city. By the mid-9th century, it was folded into the Carolingian world, and the Gothic nobility were absorbed or forgotten. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, Septimania was something rare, a liminal kingdom. A place not quite Gothic, not fully Roman, not wholly Muslim, nor completely Frankish. It was a territory of thresholds, of merchants speaking many tongues, of laws that blended cultures, of chapels built atop old temples and mosques. It was a land that belonged to no single story. To remember Septimania is to imagine a city at dawn, with Gothic scribes and shaded courtyards writing in Latin beside merchants unloading silks from Al-Andalus. It is to hear bells and calls to prayer in the same breath. To feel the heat of the sun on stone streets worn smooth by generations of traders, monks, and warriors. And then to watch it fade. Septimania did not fall with fire or flood. It was not conquered in one great battle. It dissolved gently, inevitably, into the larger forces of the Frankish realm, its uniqueness softened by time, its name eventually replaced by the growing shadow of Languedoc. But the memory lingers, quiet and golden, like light slanting through the high windows of a forgotten chapel. Let us now follow that golden light as it filters into the cool halls of early churches and forgotten sanctuaries. We journey next to a kingdom of faith misunderstood, a realm of radiant worship that slowly dimmed. Let us walk into the fading glow of the Aryan kingdoms. The glorious silence of the Aryan kingdoms. Before Christendom spoke with one voice, before the papal mitre became the final word on belief, there existed another version of the faith, older, quieter, and now nearly forgotten. It was called Arian Christianity, and, for a time, it ruled kingdoms. In the years after Rome's collapse, as the Western Empire crumbled into fragments and the last emperors faded into memory, new rulers emerged across Europe. Visigoths in Iberia, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in North Africa. Though they conquered Roman lands, they did not always adopt Roman beliefs. Many followed the teachings of Arius, a priest from Alexandria who lived in the 4th century, and whose vision of Christ was deemed heresy by the councils of the church. To the Arians, Christ was divine, but not equal to the Father. A created being, not co-eternal. Subtle differences, perhaps, to the casual ear, but to the theologians of the time, these were chasms wide enough to fracture kingdoms. And yet, despite condemnation, Arianism flourished in the early Middle Ages. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, ruled Italy with justice and grandeur, building churches whose mosaics shimmered in candlelight. In Ravenna, gold tiles still gleam with images of Christ, serene and distant in the Aryan style. There was no chaos in their halls, only dignity and devotion. A sacred stillness. The Visigoths, too, carried Aryan belief across the Pyrenees and deep into Iberia. For over a century, Aryan bishops presided over the rights of kings. Courts were adorned with learning and law. Even as Latin remained the language of scripture and power, Aryan doctrine flowed like a second current beneath the surface. These were not realms of thunder and fire, but of solemnity and restraint. Their churches were places of contemplation, not spectacle. Their prayers, whispered rather than proclaimed. They ruled in the twilight between Rome and the New Europe, tending a version of the faith that no longer has a pulpit. And then, slowly, they fell. Not always by sword, but by surrender of belief. The Visigoths eventually converted to Nicene Christianity, guided by politics as much as by conviction. The Ostrogoths were swept aside by Justinian's armies, and their churches were repurposed, re-sanctified, overwritten. The Vandals of North Africa, once powerful and feared, were simply extinguished. What remains of the Aryan kingdoms is not in doctrine, but in silence, in the quiet shimmer of mosaics that no longer match the official story. In churches where names have changed, but shadows remain. In the knowledge that even within faith, there have always been many paths, some bright, some buried. We remember them now not as enemies or rebels, but as seekers, those who believe deeply, though differently. So let us leave these silent sanctuaries, where light still lingers on ancient gold, and journey northward, where the wind carries assault and freedom, and a confederation of seafaring souls once defied empires. Let us drift toward the drowned lowlands of Frisia. Frisia, the drowned confederacy. There was once a kingdom without a crown. No throne, no marble court, no royal line etched into gilded scrolls. Instead, it was shaped by tides, by wind, by salt in the air, and stubbornness in the soul. It was Frisia, a confederacy of seafarers, traders, and fiercely independent folk who clung to the edge of the North Sea like seaweed to rock. Stretching along what is now the northern coastlines of the Netherlands and Germany, early medieval Frisia was not a kingdom in the traditional sense. It was a land of marshes and sandbanks, where the sea was both ally and adversary. Villages clung to raised earthen mounds, called terpen, built high above the reach of the restless tide. From these windswept homes, Frisians looked out not toward empires, but toward the horizon. They were a people of ships, sleek, shallow-bottomed craft designed for trade and survival. They sailed to distant shores with wool, salt, and amber. Their language danced with Germanic roots. Their faith, early on, still clung to older gods, even as missionaries ventured north with cross and chalice. They were known not for conquest, but for independence, and they protected that independence with a quiet, enduring pride. By the 7th century, Frisia was a patchwork of chieftains and councils, a loose confederacy where decisions were made in open assemblies rather than royal halls. It was a society where no one man ruled, but many voices guided. To outsiders, especially the Franks to the south, this unruly freedom was both a puzzle and a provocation. Frankish rulers such as Charles Martel and his successors launched campaigns to subdue the Frisians, to bring them under the banner of empire and faith. But the Frisians resisted with the tenacity of tide and storm. Even when eventually conquered, their spirit of autonomy remained. Charlemagne granted them the Frisian freedom, a rare legal status exempting them from feudal bondage. It was not so much a gift as a grudging respect. And then, slowly, the sea began to take what the sword could not. Over centuries, the land shifted. Storm surges breached dikes. Villages sank beneath waves. Entire islands disappeared. The North Sea, ever hungry, claimed back the coast. The outlines of Frisia blurred, not with fire or conquest, but with the quiet erosion of time and tide. What remained was scattered, a name, a culture, a memory. To walk today along the Wadden Sea coast is to hear whispers in the wind, of sailors who once set out beneath pale, gray skies, of a people who believed in freedom above all else, of churches built on mounds, and fields below sea level where sheep now graze under centuries of sky. Frisia teaches us that not all vanished realms were broken by war. Some simply slipped away, slowly and patiently, into the waiting arms of the sea. The Ghost Kings of Asturias, high in the green-wrapped mountains of northern Iberia, where the clouds hang low and the forests hold their breath, a quiet kingdom once flickered into life. It was born not in triumph, but in retreat, not from glory, but from survival. This was Asturias, a realm forged in the silence left by falling empires and ruled by kings who felt more like shadows than sovereigns. When the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 711 and swept swiftly across the Iberian Peninsula, the great Visigothic kingdom collapsed like parchment in flame. Cities fell, cathedrals were emptied, and nobles vanished into legend. But far to the north, in the misty hills beyond the grasp of cavalry and court, something ancient stirred. It is said that Pelayo, a noble of uncertain lineage, gathered remnants of the Visigothic resistance and led them to a narrow valley called Covadonga. There, beneath overhanging cliffs and dripping moss, he fought back, not with vast armies, but with the weight of memory and the fire of refusal. The Battle of Covadonga was not grand in scale, but it was profound in spirit. It marked the beginning of a kingdom that would become a whisper of defiance for generations. Asturias was small, poor, and cradled by stone. Its kings did not reign over fertile plains or bustling cities, but over wild terrain and tenacious people. And yet, within this isolation, something enduring took root. Churches were carved into caves and hillsides. Monasteries clung to cliffs like ivy. Faith deepened, not because of luxury, but because of necessity. The early kings, Pelayo, Alfonso I, Frula, and the others who followed, often seem more like figures from a dream than rulers of a realm. The chronicles speak of them in reverent tones, but the details are soft and uncertain. They governed in a world where history blurred with hagiography, and where kingship was as much spiritual as it was temporal. By the 9th century, Asturias began to stretch southward, reclaiming lands once held by the Visigoths. Slowly, deliberately, the kingdom sowed the seeds of what would later become Leon and, eventually, Castile. Asturias itself faded from the map, its name carried forward in memory, while its bones were absorbed into the broader story of Spain. But to recall Asturias is to remember the power of beginnings. Not the kind announced with trumpet and banner, but the kind whispered in the dark. It was the ember from which the long fire of the Reconquista would eventually burn, though it never claimed that title for itself. To stand in Covadonga today is to feel the presence of something quiet and enduring. A chapel still rests in the cliffside. A spring still trickles where the faithful once hid. And above it all, the mountains still keep their counsel, as they did when the first ghost kings of Asturias walked beneath their shadowed peaks. Let us follow the slope downward now, to the sunlit plains where another vanished voice once echoed. A place where kings wrote laws and languages bloomed, and where Leon, the once proud kingdom of parchments and poets, waits quietly to be remembered. The forgotten tongue of the kingdom of Leon. In the quiet highlands of northwestern Iberia, where stone villages nestle against windswept ridges and oak grows hum with time, there once flourished a kingdom both proud and fragile. Leon, its name heavy with dignity, its crown inherited from the old heart of Asturias. For a time, it was the cradle of Christian royalty in Spain, the torchbearer of Visigothic memory. And yet, what endures is not merely its kings or battles, but a voice, a language once spoken across court and countryside, now scarcely heard. The language of Leon, forgotten like a song sung to no one. After Asturias began to stretch southward, Leon emerged as its heir in the 10th century, establishing itself not merely as a buffer against Moorish realms, but as a kingdom of law, letters, and legacy. In its cloisters, parchment crackled with inked decrees. In its churches, chants echoed with reverence. By the early 12th century, Leon had birthed something remarkable, the Fuero de Leon, one of the earliest written legal charters in Europe. Even before England's Magna Carta, Leon had proclaimed rights, customs, and the outlines of civic dignity. But within its courts and councils, beneath the Latin of the scribes and the romance of the poets, there breathed another tongue. Leonese. It was a language born of Latin roots, yet shaped by the hills and hardships of the north. Spoken by farmers and lords alike, it was the living voice of the kingdom. In marketplaces, its cadences rose and fell over sacks of grain and bolts of wool. In lullabies, it lulled children beneath woolen blankets. In monasteries, it crept into the margins beside the holy script, just a phrase, a note, a comment in the common tongue. And then, slowly, Leon waned. The crown passed into the hands of Castile, that growing power to the south and east whose ambitions loomed larger with each generation. Though Leon retained its name, it became a shadow of its former self, its laws revised, its voice silenced. Castilian, which would become modern Spanish, spread swiftly through royal edicts and cathedral schools, eclipsing regional languages with a new standard. Leonese faded not with a final decree, but with time. It retreated into farmsteads and mountain villages, becoming rustic, then old-fashioned, then unknown. To reflect on the Kingdom of Leon is to remember a nation that wrote laws with care and gave voice to its people, not just in doctrine, but in everyday speech. It is to recall a court where power and poetry mingled. And it is to honor a tongue that once sang with clarity, now heard only in fragments, in the mouths of elders, in verses almost forgotten. Yet no language ever dies completely. It lingers in the soil, in names carved above doors, in the rhythm of spoken breath. And somewhere in the wind that moves across the plains of Leon, if you listen closely, the forgotten tongue still speaks. Let us follow that whisper now, eastward through valleys and rivers, to a kingdom that never truly belonged, caught between empires, languages, and faiths, the restless realm of Lotharingia. Lotharingia, a kingdom between worlds. Some kingdoms are born with borders clear and identity strong. Others emerge from compromise, caught between giants, destined to drift like mist along a river's edge. Lotharingia was one such realm, neither fully east nor west, neither wholly Frankish nor Roman, a kingdom shaped by what it was not. And because of this, it became one of the most quietly remarkable ghost realms in Europe's long medieval dusk. The story begins with the death of an emperor. When Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, passed from this world in 840, his sons quarreled over the empire he left behind. The Treaty of Verdun, signed in 843, was meant to settle their claims. The western lands went to Charles the Bald, the eastern realms to Louis the German, and between them, a slender middle kingdom was carved for Lothair, stretching from the North Sea to Italy, from the winding Meuse to the shadowed Alps. It was long and narrow, rich and varied, a corridor of cities, rivers, languages, and faiths. Though it bore the name of its ruler, Lotharingia was not truly unified. Its lands included what we now call the Low Countries, Lorraine, Burgundy, and parts of Switzerland. Its people spoke tongues that would become Dutch, French, German, and Italian. In its courts, one could hear Latin prayers, Frankish oaths, and the murmurs of distant merchants passing through. After Lothaire's death, the kingdom was divided and redivided, passed like an heirloom from hand to imperial hand. But the name Lotharingia endured, sometimes a kingdom, sometimes a duchy, sometimes a vague region on a map inked by uncertain cartographers. Its rulers were rarely strong, its borders rarely still. But in that very instability, Lotharingia became something rare, a place of connection. Abbeys and market towns flourished along its roads. Pilgrims traveled its length en route to Rome or Santiago. Scholars from Liège, Metz, and Aachen preserved knowledge while kingdoms around them warred. Lotharingia was a thread woven through Europe's fraying tapestry, holding East and West in quiet dialogue. And yet, this middle realm would not last. By the 12th century, Lotharingia as a kingdom had vanished. The Holy Roman Empire absorbed its titles. France pressed against its western edge, and duchies like Lorraine and Brabant emerged from its fragments. The memory of Lotharingia slipped beneath the surface, visible only in heraldry and half-forgotten chronicles. Its story dissolved into those of stronger states with louder names. But perhaps, like all kingdoms between worlds, it was never meant to endure. It was a bridge more than a banner, a place where Europe's future passed through in search of form. Its greatness lay not in conquest, but in connection. To remember Lotharingia is to stand in the nave of an old cathedral in Liège or Basel and feel the space between worlds. It is to walk a narrow road where Latin once met German, and French brushed against the old tongue of the Franks. Now, we step once more into the highlands, where borders blur and memory thickens, toward Carantania, where princes sat beneath open skies, and the stones themselves bore witness to forgotten rights. The enchanted realm of Carantania. In the green-veiled highlands of the Eastern Alps, where rivers gleam like silver threads and wind rustles through pine and beech, there once lay a realm unlike any other. Carantania, mysterious, melodic, and mountain-bound, was a kingdom of ritual rooted in the land, older than the maps that would one day forget it. Emerging in the 7th century from the mists of post-Roman Europe, Carantania was a Slavic principality that flourished where the modern borders of Austria and Slovenia now meet. It was neither vast nor heavily fortified, yet its people held to traditions that seemed drawn from another age, an older world of sacred stones, folk kingship, and whispered rites performed beneath open skies. The rulers of Carantania were not crowned beneath cathedral domes, nor wrapped in the jeweled trappings of empire. Instead, they were inaugurated at a great stone seat, hewn from rock, left bare beneath the sky, standing solemnly in the open air. The ritual was earthy, communal, and curiously democratic for its time. A peasant, representing the voice of the people, would question the prince to be in a rhythmic litany. Was he just? Would he protect the land? Would he honor the customs of his forebears? Only once he had answered humbly, and well would the people lift him upon a stone. Then, and only then, was he permitted to rule, not by divine right, but by consent of the land and those who lived upon it. No banners unfurled, no army saluted. The ceremony was sacred, but quiet. Carantania's culture wove together pagan echoes and early Christianity. Bells tolled from wooden chapels, but sacred groves still whispered with the memory of older gods. Herds grazed beneath craggy cliffs, and stories passed from elder to child beside hearths that had warmed the same valleys for generations. Though eventually vassalized by the Franks and later folded into the Holy Roman Empire, Carantania retained a distinct identity for centuries. Its rights survived even under foreign suzerainty. Even Charlemagne respected its customs, allowing the ancient stone inauguration to continue. long after other realms had traded such traditions for crowns and capitals. But time, as always, was patient. With the rise of centralized states and courtly systems, Carantania faded, not through conquest, but through absorption. The ritual stone was moved. The language of governance changed. By the 15th century, the old rites had become theater, the power symbolic. The enchanted realm vanished, not in fire, but in forgetfulness. Yet still, on quiet days in Carinthia and Slovenia, the past stirs. The stone remains, weathered but whole. Locals still speak of princely seats and ancient elections. And in the names of mountains, rivers, and fields, Carantania lingers, like a song just beyond hearing. To remember Carantania is to believe that kingship can be humble, that power may rise not from force, but from the earth itself. Now, let us descend from the highlands and follow the river toward the setting sun, into a kingdom that dreamed of unity beneath the cross, a place both ideal and impossible. Let us step into the twilight vision of the kingdom of Arles. The silent fall of the kingdom of Arles, where the Rhone runs wide and slow beneath ochre skies, and ancient amphitheaters crumble beside narrow alleys. There once flowed the pulse of a quiet kingdom, graceful, golden, and nearly forgotten. This was the kingdom of Arles, or Arlat, a realm born of compromise, ruled by distant emperors, and lost not to fire, but to the long, slow erosion of indifference. The story of Arles begins in the shifting light of the 10th century, when the Carolingian Empire, fractured by ambition and geography, gave rise to smaller crowns. In 933, two realms, Upper and Lower Burgundy, merged to form a kingdom stretching from the Alps to the Mediterranean, from the snow-fed lakes of Switzerland to the lavender fields of Provence. It was named for Arles, the ancient Roman city that served as its ceremonial heart. This was a land of cloisters and cathedrals, vineyards and abbeys, mountain passes and merchant routes, a place where Latin and Occitan mingled in marketplaces, and where the old Roman soul lingered in colonnades and tiled mosaics. The kingdom of Arles was not a nation of conquest, but a haven of passage, a crossroads between north and south, where traders, pilgrims, and poets met. Its rulers were rarely present. After 1033, the kingdom of Arles was joined by inheritance to the Holy Roman Empire. Emperors, German in speech and far away, held nominal authority, but the land was governed by its own dukes, bishops, and city councils. Power lay scattered, like sunlight on water, and sovereignty became a distant echo rather than a daily reality. For a time, this ambiguity gave Arles a quiet stability. Towns such as Vienne, Lyon, and Geneva flourished. Monasteries in the high valleys copied texts and cultivated vines. The Rhone carried both goods and ideas, and the kingdom held together not by force, but by tradition and shared memory. But nothing in the medieval world stood still. As the centuries passed, France pressed southward, eager to knit these fertile lands into its growing kingdom. Local lords shifted allegiance. Cities sought protection. The empire, preoccupied with its own crises, did not resist. Arles was never truly conquered. It was outgrown, like a garment set aside and slowly forgotten. By the 14th century, the kingdom of Arles existed only in titles. The name appeared in charters, yes, and on ceremonial seals. But no king rode its roads, no army defended its borders, no voice claimed its throne. It had faded into a polite fiction, a formality wrapped in parchment and ritual. To walk today through the quiet streets of Arles or Aix is to feel the hush of a kingdom that chose endurance over ambition. It did not fall with clangor, but with grace. The kingdom of Arles teaches us that some realms vanish not from weakness, but from the steady tide of change. That peace, while quiet, leaves little echo. The Teutonic dream of Prussia, where the Baltic mists cling to pine forests and the wind carries a chill even in summer. A stark and solemn vision once rose from the cold earth. A kingdom not born of lineage or tribe, but of vow and conquest. This was Prussia, a realm dreamed into being by knights in white cloaks and black crosses, forged at the edge of Christian Europe by the fire of holy war and the silence of winter snow. In the early 13th century, a group of crusaders called the Teutonic Knights set their gaze upon the pagan lands that lay beyond the Vistula River. These lands were home to the Old Prussians, a Baltic people who lived close to the forest and sea, worshipped in sacred groves, and followed a rhythm untouched by Latin or crown. They had resisted conversion for centuries, their shrines older than Rome's reach, their gods quiet and deep as the northern soil. But the Teutonic Knights came not as merchants or pilgrims, but as instruments of empire and belief. With papal blessing and imperial support, they launched a holy mission, not to Jerusalem, but to the frostbitten frontiers of the north. They built castles of stone and iron, stark against the pale sky. From these strongholds, they swept outward, converting by sword, baptizing by siege. The Prussians fought fiercely, but their resistance was scattered, their alliances few. Village by village, shrine by shrine, they fell. And in their place, the Teutonic Order erected a vision of order and devotion. A monastic state ruled by martial discipline, where priests carried swords and silence was a virtue. They named it Prussia. It was not a kingdom in the traditional sense. There was no native dynasty, no crown prince. Instead, it was a state governed by the Grand Master of the Order, a land where stone chapels stood atop the ruins of groves, and laws were drawn from scripture and steel. The Order's capital, Marienburg, rose like a fortress of faith, its red walls towering above the Nogat River, an austere monument to divine authority. Yet no dream lasts forever, even those built of faith and fire. By the 15th century, the Teutonic Order's grip weakened. The rise of Poland-Lithuania, the strain of war, and the growing discontent of their own subjects unraveled the dream. In time, Prussia was secularized. The knights became princes, the sword gave way to diplomacy, and the old banner of the cross faded into the emblems of dynasties. Still, the name endured. Prussia would rise again, first as duchy, then as kingdom, then as empire. But that later Prussia, clad in powdered wigs and cannon smoke, was not this one. The Teutonic dream belonged to a colder, quieter age. To remember the first Prussia is to hear boots crunching on snow outside a wooden chapel, to feel the weight of fur-lined armor, to glimpse a black cross against white wool disappearing into fog. The twilight of Navarre. High in the Pyrenees, where the mountains breathe mist and memory into the valleys below, there once thrived a kingdom small in size, yet vast in soul. Navarre, nestled between giants, hardened by isolation, softened by tradition, was a realm that lingered longer than most, resisting the pull of empire and erosion. Its twilight came not in a blaze of war, but in a hush, like the last candle extinguished in a stone chapel after Vespers. Navarre's story is ancient. Born in the 9th century, as the northern Iberian hills repelled Moorish advances and resisted Frankish control, it emerged as a beacon of independence in a world cleaved by faith and power. Centered around the town of Pamplona, once a Roman outpost, later a mountain stronghold, it became the heart of a kingdom defined less by conquest than by endurance. For centuries, Navarre stood apart. Its kings ruled through valleys threaded with old languages. Euskera, the tongue of the Basques, echoed in meadows and monasteries. Its laws were rooted not in Rome, but in custom. Its people lived between worlds, where Christian devotion coexisted with stubborn ancestral pride. And yet, despite its modest size, Navarre played host to saints and pilgrims, poets and princes. The famed Camino de Santiago passed through its land, bringing not only trade, but stories of miracles, of relics, of distant wars. But the high road is never without shadows. By the 13th century, the crown of Navarre passed through marriage into foreign hands. First to France, then, briefly, to the Capetians. Though the kingdom retained its name and institutions, it became a pawn in the wider chessboard of European ambition. As Castile to the south grew bold and France to the north grew vast, Navarre's autonomy narrowed like a stream in drought. The kingdom split. Its southern lands, Lower Navarre, were gradually absorbed by the rising might of Spain. Its northern half, tucked into what is now France, persisted in name, ruled by a line of monarchs who dreamed more of unity than separation. And yet, even there, the ancient crown remained a symbol of something older, purer. One of the last sparks came in the form of Henry III of Navarre, who would become Henry IV of France. With him, the crown of Navarre merged finally with the French throne. Though technically still a kingdom, Navarre now drifted fully into the folds of greater powers, its distinctiveness filed down by law and language. Yet, even in fading, Navarre left behind a scent of wild thyme and distant bells. To remember Navarre is to stand at a mountain pass at dusk, where the wind carries the whisper of hoofbeats and the smell of smoke from shepherd's fire. It is to walk beneath ancient stone arches in Pamplona, hearing the echo of forgotten Basque lullabies, the murmur of a people who never forgot who they were, even when the world around them did. Dalmatia, the stone choir of the Adriatic. Along the rugged edge of the Adriatic, where the mountains fall steeply into the sea and stone cities rise like carved hymns from the shoreline, there once thrived a land of many voices and one enduring song. Dalmatia, a name carried on salt winds and marble walls, echoed in cloisters and bell towers. A region too fluid to be an empire, too ancient to be merely a province. It was not always a kingdom in the strictest sense, but Dalmatia, ever liminal, was a realm in spirit, and its story, a choral harmony of faith, defiance, and fading glory. In Roman times, Dalmatia was a frontier of marble roads and imperial garrisons, a land where Latin flowered even as storms gathered beyond the borders. After the empire's western half fell into shadow, Dalmatian cities remained, tenacious, walled, and watchful. From the 6th century onward, they clung to their Roman identity like coral to rock, even as Slavic tribes flowed into the interior hills. Latin never quite disappeared. Instead, it softened, turned local, evolved into Dalmatian, a Romance tongue spoken in coastal alleys and quiet harbors, now vanished from the world, but once vibrant as sea birds over white stone quays. For centuries, Dalmatia lived between powers. Byzantines claimed it in name, Venetians eyed it with longing, and Slavic principalities emerged inland, slowly reshaping the landscape. And yet, Dalmatian cities like Split, Zadar, and Dubrovnik endured, semi-autonomous and semi-feudal, linked not by a single monarch, but by trade, salt, and a stubborn civic pride. They built cathedrals of pale limestone and palaces that shimmered in the Adriatic sun. Bells rang out over red-tiled roofs, their peals softening as they reached the open sea. Here, East met West in quiet compromise. Orthodox and Catholic, Slavic and Latin, Greek icon and Roman arch, Dalmatia held them all in tension, without fully surrendering to any. Diocletian's palace in Split became a city within a ruin, lived in and lived through. Fishermen passed beneath crumbling columns. Monks copied manuscripts in towers once meant for emperors. Over time, Venice would tighten its grasp, cloaking Dalmatian cities in its lion-bannered shadow. Still, the stones sang with older melodies. Even under Venetian suzerainty, local councils held sway, and traditions rooted in Roman municipal life endured into the Renaissance. But the Venetian dream, too, would fade. Ottomans pressed from the east, Habsburgs from the north, and Dalmatia, ever splintered, slowly dissolved into greater sovereignties. What remains today are echoes, strong, clear, and eternal. The rhythm of waves against ancient quay stones. The cool hush of Romanesque churches built on pagan temples. The winding streets that follow no grid, only memory. A stone choir still singing. To remember Dalmatia is to hear that song. Not loud, but persistent. A harmony of lost languages and layered faiths, of sun-bleached limestone and the scent of rosemary on ocean air. The kingdom of Syagrius, Rome's final echo. In the twilight of empire, when the legions no longer marched and the marble colonnades grew quiet, there flickered one last Roman light beyond the walls of the eternal city. It did not shine in Rome itself, nor in Constantinople, but far to the north, in a quiet land of forests and rivers, near the banks of the Somme. Here, in what would one day be northern France, a Roman general held fast to fading order. His name was Syagrius, and his realm was the final echo of Rome in the west. The Western Roman Empire is often said to have fallen in 476 AD, when the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. Yet history rarely ends so neatly. In the northern province of Gaul, in a land once called Gallia Lugdunensis, Rome endured a little longer, not through imperial decree, but through stubborn continuity. Syagrius, son of the patrician Aegidius, was not a crowned emperor nor an elected consul. He was a military commander, a dux who inherited both his father's army and his loyalty to a dying idea. From his seat in Soissons, he governed the remnants of Roman Gaul with dignity and discipline. The people called his realm the Kingdom of Soissons, though Syagrius himself claimed no royal title. To him, he was still a Roman governor, serving an empire that no longer answered. This final Roman fragment stood as a quiet anomaly in a continent reshaped by new powers. The Visigoths ruled in the south, the Burgundians in the east, and to the north, the Salian Franks gathered strength beneath their ambitious young king, Clovis. For nearly 2 decades, Syagrius held his ground. Roman law persisted in his courts. Latin was spoken in his assemblies. Roads were still maintained, taxes still levied, civic life still ordered as if the world had not changed. But change was inevitable. In 486, Clovis marched upon Soissons. The two forces met in battle, one the fresh vigor of a rising people, the other the weary resilience of a fading world. Syagrius was defeated. He fled south, seeking refuge with the Visigoths, but Clovis demanded his surrender. Reluctantly, the Visigoths gave him up, and Syagrius was executed. With his death, the last Roman territory in the west passed into the hands of the Franks. The empire was gone. Yet to remember Syagrius is not to mourn a failure, but to honor a last stand. His kingdom was not marked by glory or expansion, but by faithfulness to an idea, to a rhythm of life, to a vision of civilization held gently against the rising tide. Even in its ending, the kingdom of Soissons whispered something enduring, that Rome, for all its failings, had planted roots so deep that even in its ruin, men still tried to live as Romans. The realm of Elmet, a woodland whisper. There are some kingdoms whose names echo with power: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. But there are others, softer and stranger, whose memory clings not to chronicles or crowns, but to the land itself. Elmet was one such realm, a woodland kingdom, a whisper beneath the trees. Nestled in what is now West Yorkshire, Elmet was a Celtic stronghold that lingered long after Roman legions had vanished and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had begun to rise. It existed in a quiet cleft of history, from the late 5th to the early 7th century, when the island of Britain was neither Roman nor wholly Saxon, but something in between. A patchwork of war bands and hill forts, of lingering druids and new Christian voices, of fading Latin and resurgent Brittonic. Elmet was never large, nor heavily fortified. It had no shining capital, no empire of roads. It was a forested domain, bounded by rivers and hills, where oaks stretched their limbs wide over sacred springs, and settlements rose from glades like breath from still morning earth. Its people spoke a language descended from the ancient Britons, and though they lacked the might of their neighbors, they held tightly to their land, their lore, and their kings. The most well-remembered of these kings was Ceredig, who ruled in the early 7th century. He is spoken of in the Historia Brittonum as a ruler of dignity and defiance, though the details are dim. In his time, Elmet was caught between growing powers, Northumbria to the north, Mercia to the south, Dara pressing in from the east. It was a woodland island surrounded by tides. Christianity had begun to find its way into these hidden groves, brought by Celtic missionaries from the west. Stone churches were still rare, but crosses were carved in wood, and psalms were sung beneath the same trees where older gods had once been honored. The spiritual rhythm of Elmet was slow and cyclical, in tune with seasons and soil. But kingdoms born of quiet are often ended by clamor. Around the year 617, the Northumbrian king Edwin marched south and absorbed Elmet into his growing realm. The forest fell under new rule, and Ceredig vanishes from the record, like mist beneath morning sun. The people of Elmet were not destroyed, but subsumed. Some fled, others stayed and blended, their language slowly buried beneath Old English and the passing of generations. And yet, Elmet did not disappear completely. Its name clings to the land, to Elmet Moor, to Sherwood-like forests, and place names where Celtic roots still twist beneath Saxon syllables. In the soil of West Yorkshire, archaeologists still unearth fragments, fibulae, pottery, bones, quiet testimonies to a people who lived with the trees. To remember Elmet is to walk through fog-laced woods at dawn, the leaf-littered damp beneath your feet, the air heavy with birdsong and memory. It is to feel the presence of something just beyond sight, a woodland whisper, a forgotten realm not lost but resting. The dust and silence of Almeria. Beneath a sun that seems to hold its breath, where the mountains fold like ancient parchment and the desert brushes against the sea, lies a land where silence is older than stone. Almeria, wind-scoured and sun-bleached, poised on the southeastern fringe of Al-Andalus, was once a beacon of wealth, knowledge, and luminous craftsmanship. Now, it slumbers beneath layers of time and sand, whispering only to those who listen closely. In the 10th century, Almeria was not a forgotten corner, but a glittering coastal jewel. It rose to prominence during the height of the Caliphate of Córdoba, when Muslim Spain flourished in cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada. But Almeria, facing the open Mediterranean, became something else, a port of marvels. Silk, amber, glass, ivory, and spices flowed through its harbors. Looms wove fine cloth in secret patterns. Poets gathered in tiled courtyards, where fountains murmured beside orange trees. The air shimmered with the scent of jasmine and salt. It was not merely a city, but a taifa, a small, independent kingdom carved from the fractured remains of the Caliphate's decline. In the early 11th century, when Al-Andalus broke into fragments, Almeria stood proudly on its own. Under the rule of powerful merchant kings like Jaron and Almadicin, it became a hub of Mediterranean commerce, rivaling even Genoa and Pisa in reach and elegance. Its fleet, strong and swift, ruled the waves from the Balearics to the Maghreb. But as with all things born of brilliance, the light began to thin. The Christian kingdoms to the north, Castile, Aragon, Leon, grew bold. One by one, the Taifa kingdoms fell to their advance or were drawn into uneasy alliances. In 1147, Almeria was captured by Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile in a brief but devastating campaign. Though the city was later reclaimed by the Almohads, the shimmer had dulled. The rhythm of decline had begun. Almeria's fate was sealed in quiet retreat. No great final siege, no catastrophic betrayal, just the slow ebbing of prosperity. Earthquakes came, trade shifted, walls crumbled. By the late 15th century, when the last Nasrid kings held Granada with trembling hands, Almeria was no longer the city of silk and song it had once been. When the Catholic monarchs took it in 1489, it was already fading, its minarets quiet, its harbors hushed. Today, the Almeria of poetry and gold lies mostly beneath dust. The Alcazaba still stands, vast and sunburned, watching over a modern city that barely remembers the luminous Taifa it once housed. Yet, if you walk through the winding old streets, especially at dawn or just before dusk, there is a stillness that feels eternal. A hush between breaths, between centuries. To remember Almeria is to recall the fragility of splendor, the softness with which a golden age can vanish. No explosion, no anthem, just dust and silence. The Papal Kingdom of the Crusader States. Far from the green hills of Europe, across deserts windswept and holy, beneath stars foreign to Western eyes, a strange echo of Christendom once took root in blood and prayer. The Crusader States, names etched into sun-scorched stone: Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. For a time, they were not merely footholds of war, but fragile kingdoms, born of vow and ambition, guided by papal blessing, and lit by the flickering torch of devotion. They were never meant to last, yet they burned brightly, suspended between heaven and history. In 1099, after a journey of unthinkable hardship, the First Crusade reached Jerusalem. The city was taken by sword, by siege, by sanctified violence. And in the days that followed, a kingdom was declared where none had stood for centuries. The kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled not by local lords or Roman heirs, but by men who believed they held God's will in their mailed fists. Though sovereign in name, the Crusader States were always tethered to a higher power. The Pope, across the sea and the centuries, claimed moral authority over these realms. The Holy See named patriarchs, sanctioned kings, and sent clerics west to raise funds and fighters. And so, a new type of state emerged, Christian in rite, Latin in ritual, but foreign in soil. These are not organic kingdoms. They were holy scaffolding built upon sacred ground. The kingdom of Jerusalem stood at the heart of this spiritual empire, with a crown shaped by both faith and fear. Its kings walked where Christ had walked, yet ruled like anxious stewards, never far from threat. To their north lay the Principality of Antioch and the county of Edessa. To their west, the restless sea. To their east and south, a crescent of powerful Islamic states, watching and waiting. Within the walls of these Crusader capitals, Gothic arches rose alongside Arab courtyards. Latin chants drifted through streets once ruled by caliphs and emirs. Knights mingled with merchants, monks with Greek and Armenian priests. The air was thick with contradiction, a place where the West tried to root itself in Eastern soil and where the past pressed hard against the present. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader States held on, barely. Edessa fell in 1144. Antioch endured but weakened. Tripoli staggered forward. Jerusalem itself was lost in 1187. retaken briefly, then finally surrendered. One by one, the kingdoms crumbled, not all at once, but like candles snuffed in a breeze. By 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last ember of the Crusader presence on the mainland was extinguished. And yet, for a time, they had stood. To remember the papal kingdom of the Crusader States is to glimpse the uneasy marriage of faith and power, of dream and dominion. These were kingdoms never quite at peace, ruled by swords sharpened by scripture, and guided by a church that saw in them both divine mission and temporal might. Echoes in the cartographer's silence. And so, we come to the edges of the map. Not the farthest points of land, but the softest corners of memory. Here, in the white spaces once left blank by trembling quills, lie kingdoms with no flags, no armies, no rulers to mark their fall. This is the realm of forgotten borders and unnamed thrones. The kingdoms that vanished not in conquest, but in ink and time. What happens to a kingdom when no one remembers it? Once, cartographers sketched the known world with lines both bold and delicate. They wrote names into mountains and stitched rivers into meaning. But always there were silences, vast pale gaps, places not yet charted or once known and now lost. These spaces were not always wilderness. They were sometimes homes to peoples, customs, and kings whose stories simply unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing remained but a faint suggestion, a faint suspicion. Consider the Kingdom of the Isles, a patchwork of sea-lashed lands scattered across the Hebrides and the Irish Sea. It thrived for centuries in the swells between Norse raiders and Gaelic kings, between Scottish ambitions and Irish myth. Its rulers bore names heavy with salt and legend: Somerled, Godred, Ragnall. And yet, no capital rose to permanence, no great archive survived. When it faded, it did so quietly, swallowed by larger kingdoms that needed clearer borders and simpler tales. There are dozens more. The March of Verona, where Latin and German blurred in the shadow of the Alps. The mysterious lordship of the Banate of Severin, carved and erased on the edge of Hungary. The Emirate of Crete, the Judicate of Arborea. Even now, their names ring with a music no longer played. They dwell in the footnotes of chronicles, the margins of medieval maps, the dreams of those who dare to ask, what did we forget? And still, the silence remains. It is in this silence that we find the last kingdom, not of stone, nor gold, nor law, but of memory. A kingdom we carry with us in our imagining, a realm built in the space between what was recorded and what was lived. To dwell on these vanished places is not to grieve, but to listen. Each forgotten crown, each quiet fall, reminds us that history is not only what survives, but what slips away. The parchment yellows, the ink fades, the map cracks at the fold. But if you close your eyes and let the stillness settle, you can hear them. The whispers of voices long silent, the rustle of robes in an empty court, the sound of wind through an abandoned cloister. Here ends our journey through Europe's vanished kingdoms. But the echo continues. So may you sleep now, beneath the canopy of time, with forgotten crowns above and the hush of lost nations around you. Let the silence cradle you, for in the quiet, the kingdoms still dream. Rest well, traveler. The map is folded. The candle is low, and history, ever patient, keeps its watch.